Today is a day that holds a very special place in my heart. Mother's Day.
There was once a voice so powerful it could stop time. A voice that carried nations, stitched up broken hearts, and made silence itself seem holy. That voice belonged to Céline Dion, a girl who rose from a wooden drawer in Quebec to become a global anthem. The world didn't just listen to her, it breathed through her. She sang of love, not the kind in fairy tales, but the kind that lives after death. She sang grief not as a tragedy, but as a triumph. Her voice wasn't just music, it was memory. It was medicine. It was a sanctuary for millions who had nowhere else to go. And yet now, that voice is silent. Not because she lost her will to sing, but because her body, bit by bit, has started to betray her. Her muscles harden, her breath shortens. Her vocal cords, once weapons of glory, tremble like broken wings. The woman who once soared above stadiums now lies still, whispering lullabies in the dark to the sons she once bled to bring into this world. How do you measure a life like hers? By the $800 million she earned, the 250 million records she sold, the standing ovations in every language on earth? Number, you measure it in what it cost her. The birthdays she missed, the children she longed to hold, the love that died in her arms, the body that broke while she kept singing. Her life is not a fairy tale. It is an elegy written in gold and grief. We've seen the gowns, the Grammys, the glory, but what we didn't see was the woman collapsing backstage, holding her chest, praying that tomorrow she'd still be able to speak. This is not a story of fame. This is a story of survival, of sacrifice so complete, so invisible, you'd never know unless you listened between the notes. Because when the crowd cheers, it drowns out the sound of breaking. So now, as the world grows quieter without her, we ask, how do you say goodbye to a voice that refused to stop singing even when the world stopped listening? Before the red carpets, before the standing ovations, there was a baby wrapped not in silk, but in hand-me-down blankets. Not lying in a crib, but in a drawer pulled from a wooden cabinet. That drawer was her first cradle, its creaking bottom, the first stage. Céline Marie Claudette Dion was born on the 30th of March, 1968, in Charlemagne, Quebec, a tiny French-Canadian town where winters were long, wallets were thin, and dreams were considered luxuries. She was the youngest of 14 children, a miracle in a house already bursting with mouths to feed and music to share. Her parents were both musicians, but their harmony echoed off empty cupboards and cold walls. Some nights there was music, some nights there was hunger, but always there was love. In that overcrowded home, noise was constant laughter, arguments, footsteps, singing. But Celine listened differently. While other kids played with dolls, she pressed her ear to the floor, waiting for her older siblings to rehearse. Music wasn't a pastime. It was the only thing that felt full when the stomach wasn't. Her lullabies came not from loving hands, but from overheard melodies, fragments of notes that floated in from another room, late at night, as the cold crept through the floorboards. From the very first breath, Celine's life wasn't about comfort, it was about endurance. And through that endurance, something otherworldly was born. At 5, she stood at her brother's wedding and opened her mouth to sing. What came out wasn't cute, it was staggering. There was already depth in her voice, like she'd lived 100 lives in those 5 short years. People didn't clap out of politeness, they cried. At 12, she began writing songs with her mother. Her brother Michel recorded her first demo. 1 cassette, 1 chance. They sent it to a man named Ren Anglil, a Montreal-based music producer known for discovering talent, but never anything like this. When Ren pressed play, he didn't hear a child. He heard something sacred. Tears welled in his eyes. And then he did the unthinkable. He mortgaged his home to finance her debut album. Not because he saw potential, but because he saw prophecy. At that time, Celine was a shy girl with crooked teeth and downcast eyes. She didn't have a stylist. She didn't have English. She barely had confidence. But she had that voice a force of nature wrapped in a fragile frame. While other girls her age were going to school dances, Celine was in freezing studios, rehearsing syllables she didn't understand. She learned to pronounce English phonetically, mimicking every word, every vowel, like it was life or death, because to her, it was. She gave up slumber parties for vocal lessons. She gave up recess for rhythm. She gave up girlhood for greatness. In 1981, at just 13, her first single, Ce n'était qu'un rêve, It Was Only a Dream, was released. But it was not just a dream, it was the start of something seismic. By 14, she stepped onto the stage at the Yamaha World Popular Song Festival in Tokyo. In front of 115 million viewers, the girl who once slept in a drawer sang loud enough to shake the world. But behind the glittering gown and the booming applause was still that same child hungry not for fame, but to be heard. In later interviews, Celine would look back at those early years, not with resentment, but with reverence. "I'd sleep in that drawer again," she once said, "if it meant I could still sing." Because for her, singing wasn't just a career, it was salvation. He was a man at the edge of his career. She was a girl at the very beginning of hers. When Ren Angel first heard the voice on that cassette tape, something ancient stirred inside him. It wasn't just sound, it was soul. Raw, trembling, infinite. It made him cry. Not because it was polished, but because it was pure. And then he did what no music executive would dare do. He bet his house, his only home, on a girl the world had never heard of. A girl with no records, no name, and no English. That moment wasn't business. It was a divine gamble, a sacred risk that would alter both their lives forever. From that point forward, their lives became a shared orbit. Ren wasn't just her manager. He became her translator, her defender, her compass in the storm. When others saw a marketable voice, he saw a spirit. He shielded her from pressures no child should ever face. He handled the contracts, the headlines, the chaos, so she could focus on one thing, singing. While the world fell in love with her gowns and grace, Ren stood quietly off stage, never asking for credit, only making sure she could keep going. When she was tired, he spoke for her. When she was scared, he held her hand. When she faltered, he reminded her, "You were born for this." Slowly, the girl who once doubted her own worth began to see herself through his eyes, not as a product, not even as a star, but as a once-in-a-generation artist. And somewhere along the journey, that trust became something else, something tender, something sacred. At 19, she handed him a letter handwritten, trembling with emotion. It was a confession. She had fallen in love with the man who believed in her more than she ever had. It would have been easy to hide, to walk away from something the world would question, criticize, misunderstand. But Celine wasn't afraid. Love, to her, wasn't something to explain. It was something to honor. Their relationship remained private, not out of shame, but protection. What they shared wasn't a scandal, it was a shelter. In 1994, at the majestic Notre Dame Basilica in Montreal, she walked down the aisle not as a global icon, but as a woman choosing devotion over public opinion. She didn't need to convince anyone. Her love had always been loud enough for two. Their marriage wasn't loud. It was luminous. Ren wasn't just her husband. He was the mirror she trusted, the voice that steadied hers, the presence that made silence feel safe. He managed her tours and tucked their children into bed. He stood behind every performance, unseen but always there. When she sang about love, she wasn't interpreting lyrics. She was telling the truth. They built a life where Grammy nights followed bottle feedings, and standing ovations came after whispered goodnights. Fame surrounded them, but their bond was rooted in something deeper, something time could not corrode. She once said, "He was the only man who made me feel safe enough to be entirely myself." And when she finally shared their love with the world, she stood tall not to justify it, but to celebrate it. Because love like that doesn't ask permission. It simply is. While other girls wore braces and dreamed of high school dances, she was learning to pronounce love phonetically under fluorescent lights. While classmates passed notes in class, she passed microphones between rehearsals and recording booths. Céline Dion didn't grow up. She grew through the spotlight. From the very start, her voice wasn't treated as a gift, it was treated as a lifeline. Not just for her, but for 14 mouths that once shared slices of bread cut in thirds. Her family had love but no money, and in the face of that, her voice became their only shot at survival. She trained like a soldier, hours spent perfecting vowels in a language she didn't speak. Nights lost to vocal drills instead of sleepovers. No school plays, no crushes, no prom. In her memoir, My Story, My Dream, Celine would later write, "I never had a teenage life. I don't remember prom. I remember microphones. I remember costumes. I remember waking up at 5 a.m. for sound check." By 12, she had already left behind the world of childhood. By 14, she was an international star. She didn't sing for applause. She sang because she had to, because every note might pay the heating bill, because her success meant her parents might never have to choose between food and music again. When she won the Yamaha World Popular Song Festival in Tokyo in 1982, it wasn't just a career milestone. It was a declaration. The little girl from Charlemagne, who once sang to drown out her hunger, now sang to feed her family. But success doesn't come without subtraction. Every standing ovation was paid for with absence. Every award cost her a memory she would never get to make. Her childhood was bartered for stages. Her innocence traded for itinerary schedules. She never wore a backpack to school, but she knew how to navigate airport terminals. She didn't just carry her own dreams. She carried the debt Ren had taken on, the hopes of her parents, the faith of a nation hungry for a story of escape. Her smile shone in interviews, but her eyes always looked a little older, like they'd seen too much, too soon. And still, she never complained. Because to Celine, it was never about being famous. It was about never going back to that cold drawer. About proving that a girl with nothing but melody could change everything. In the glimmer of stardom, the world saw perfection. But in the silences between shows, there was a young girl learning how to hold up not just a career, but the weight of everyone she loved. The world remembers the moments. The Titanic theme swelling across oceans, the golden gowns, the Vegas lights, the standing ovations that seem to last forever. But what they don't remember is the pain between the notes. Céline Dion's career wasn't just successful, it was unprecedented. She sold over 250 million records, headlined a Las Vegas residency that changed the very definition of live performance. Won Grammys, won Oscars, built empires in fashion, fragrance, and real estate. Her voice wasn't just popular, it was divine. But divinity always comes at a cost. Every record sold carried a hidden scar. Every show performed came at the price of one more piece of herself. She wasn't just singing songs, she was bleeding into them. By the time she stood on stage to sing My Heart Will Go On, the world wept with her but didn't know they were also weeping for her. That song wasn't written in a studio. It was written somewhere deeper, in the space between memory and grief. Because by then, Celine was already breaking. Not publicly, not visibly, but slowly, like glass under pressure. She was collapsing backstage, wrapped in towels, fighting off migraines. She was losing sleep, pushing through vocal injuries, numbing her body with silence so her voice could roar. She sang until her throat was raw. Then she sang again. In 2003, when she signed the Vegas residency, a move the press mocked as career suicide, she didn't flinch. She turned it into resurrection. Over 700 shows. More than $600 million in ticket sales. More than 3 million people sat in her presence and felt seen. Because Celine didn't just perform. She confessed. She testified. She turned concerts into cathedrals, sanctuaries where strangers found healing. Not because she hit the high notes, but because she meant every syllable. But behind the sequins, something inside her was wilting. While the spotlight blazed, her body dimmed. She smiled for the cameras, but her muscles trembled beneath the gown. She sang of strength while privately losing her own. Yet she never stepped away, never cancelled without reason, never let the world see the weight she carried on stage and off. Because to Celine, the show wasn't about fame. It was about the sacred contract between her and the people who had no other place to cry. And so, even as her spirit fractured, her voice stood tall. But make no mistake, every note she gave us was a piece of herself she never got back. To the world, he was her manager. To her, he was everything. Ren Anglil didn't just discover Céline Dion, he built the world where she could bloom. Before she ever knew her worth, he saw it. Before she had confidence, he had conviction. Where others saw a child with a pretty voice, Ren saw a legacy waiting to be written. He believed so deeply, he bet his future on hers. He was the fire behind every spotlight, the voice behind every decision, the stillness in every storm. While reporters asked questions and fans screamed her name, Ren stood quietly in the shadows, praying she would shine not for the world, but for herself. Their love didn't begin with passion. It began with protection. He was her translator when English failed her, her advocate when contracts grew complicated, her anchor when the stage lights burned too hot. As she grew into her voice, their bond deepened. The shy girl with trembling hands began to fall for the man who never asked her to be anything but herself. At 19, she handed him a handwritten letter, a confession wrapped in ink and vulnerability. At 20, love bloomed. Quietly, privately. Not because it was forbidden, but because it was fragile. She wasn't a headline. She was a woman learning what safety felt like. They kept their love hidden not in shame, but in reverence. What they had wasn't tabloid fodder. It was sanctuary. When she finally revealed their relationship, the world didn't cheer. It judged, it questioned. But Celine didn't flinch, because her love for Ren was not a phase, it was a compass. In 1994, she walked down the aisle at the Notre Dame Basilica in Montreal not as a superstar, but as a bride choosing forever. She wore white, but her heart carried the weight of every song he'd helped her sing. Their marriage was never loud. It was luminous. Ren wasn't just her husband. He was her manager, her mirror, her muse, the man who whispered belief into her bones when she forgot how to be brave. He protected her career like a cathedral. He fathered her children with devotion. He knew when to step forward and, more importantly, when to step back. He was the reason she could take risks, because she knew he'd be there to catch her if she fell. When she sang about love, she wasn't interpreting. She was testifying to the kind of love that doesn't fade with time but deepens through storms, to the kind of loyalty that never demands attention but never disappears, to the kind of man who sacrificed the spotlight so she could stand in it. Behind every award, every note, every unforgettable performance was Ren, not needing applause, just needing her to believe. And she did, with everything she had. Their love was not built for Instagram, it was built for eternity. And even now, in the stillness of her quietest days, when no audience remains and the lights have dimmed, Celine knows she has never stood alone. It wasn't supposed to end like that. Not for them. Not for the man who gave her a voice, and the woman who gave him a reason to believe again. But even the deepest love cannot bargain with time. In 2013, the first blow came quietly. Ren was diagnosed with throat cancer, a cruel irony for the man who had built his life around music and voices. For Celine, it was like hearing her future begin to dissolve syllable by syllable. She stepped off the stage without hesitation. Tours were cancelled, spotlight dimmed, applause faded into sterile hospital beeps and whispered prayers. She wasn't a star. She was a wife sitting beside a man slowly vanishing. The world kept cheering, but she was somewhere else, entirely holding his hand as it grew colder, singing lullabies to silence. They had always been one heartbeat. Now his was fading, and hers was breaking. On the 14th of January, 2016, the silence finally won. Ren took his last breath. There was no drama, no noise, just absence, the kind of absence that rewrites a person from the inside out. The woman who had once stood unshaken before billions collapsed inside, but not publicly. She didn't scream, she didn't crumble before cameras. Her grief was too sacred for spectacle. Instead, she stood. For him, she walked back into the Notre Dame Basilica, where they had once said, forever, but this time she walked alone. The aisle that had once felt like destiny now stretched like an eternity. The pew beside her was empty. The air didn't breathe. Her eyes didn't cry. They hollowed. And as the choir sang for the man she had loved more than life, she sat in the same place they had once begun and realized she was now the keeper of both halves of their promise. That day wasn't just his funeral, it was the burial of their story. From that moment on, every note she sang became something different. Not performance, not praise, but mourning. The sequins sparkled. Yes, the high notes soared, but somewhere, in every performance, a chair remained empty. Somewhere, just outside the spotlight, her heart tilted upward and whispered, "Did you hear that, my love?" Because love like that doesn't die. It just changes form. It lingers in dressing rooms, in echoing hallways, in whispered prayers behind curtains. And every time she takes a bow, she bows for two. Even now, when the world sees only one figure on stage, Celine knows she has never truly been alone. Not when the one who believed in her more than anyone still listens from the quiet. Some people say time heals all wounds. But time never gave Celine Dion the chance, because just 2 days after laying her husband to rest, she had to bury her brother. Daniel Dion, her childhood companion, her constant in a house full of chaos, the boy who once hummed lullabies with her in freezing bedrooms, was gone. Cancer had claimed him too, swift, unforgiving. As if grief itself was chasing her down with sharpened teeth. There was no space between losses, no room to breathe, no pause to process. Within 48 hours, she had lost the man who built her future and the boy who knew her past. Daniel wasn't just a sibling. He was a thread woven into the earliest melodies of her life. They had grown up sharing food, sharing silence, sharing dreams. And now, she stood before his casket with knuckles clenched, heart hollowed out twice in 1 week. She didn't collapse. She moved through rituals like a ghost dressed in black. She hugged mourners with hands that shook. She smiled, but her eyes were somewhere else. At Daniel's memorial, there were no choirs, no glittering gowns. There was only a sister lighting a candle with fingers that had just laid her husband in the ground. People whispered that she'd grown thinner, quieter, that grief had made her look like glass. Because how does one survive 2 funerals without letting part of the soul fall into the grave with them? But this wasn't the first time Celine had lost someone she loved too soon. Years earlier, there was Karine, her niece, only 16, struck down by cystic fibrosis, one of the cruelest diseases imaginable. While the world cheered for Celine's rising stardom, she sat in hospital rooms lit not by stage lights, but by blinking monitors. Not as a star, but as an aunt, whispering lullabies through oxygen masks. And when Karine died, the world moved on. There were no headlines, no tributes, but Celine didn't need cameras. She had a piano, and from that piano came one of the most fragile, holy songs she would ever create. Though, fly, not for fame, not for charts, but as a prayer, a final lullaby for the girl who never got to grow up. And then, just when she thought she had endured the worst, life took her mother. Vestizion Maman Dion was more than a parent. She was Celine's first audience, first coach, first believer. It was her mother who placed lyrics in her tiny hands. Her mother who wrote her first song. Her mother who stood backstage smiling, never asking for applause, just praying that her daughter would soar. And in January 2020, the light that had lit Celine's earliest stage quietly went out. There were no dramatic cancellations, no tabloid meltdowns. Celine did what her mother had raised her to do. She dressed in black, stood tall, and sang, not because the grief was gone, but because music was the only language she had ever known that could carry mourning and memory at once. Later, friends would say she whispered "Mama" into empty hotel rooms, clutched photographs until her knuckles turned white, that she grew even quieter, even thinner, because some griefs don't roar, they hum. And Celine Dion was now carrying the weight of 3 deaths, in one voice, in one heart, in one lifetime, For the woman who had everything, fame, fortune, a voice that touched the sky, there was still one thing she couldn't summon with talent or money: motherhood. It didn't come easily. It didn't come naturally. It came at a cost no spotlight would ever reveal. After marrying Ren, the man who had risked everything to give her a voice, Celine dreamed of giving him something in return: a child, a future, a family of their own. But nature, cruel and silent, stood in the way. The world saw her on red carpets in shimmering gowns. What they didn't see were the bruises on her belly from IVF injections, the hormone treatments, the surgeries, the months of silence after miscarriage. She would walk onto a stage, smile for millions, hit the high notes, and then collapse behind the curtain, weeping for the child she never got to hold. She didn't talk about it. She endured it, because that's what Céline Dion had always done: turned pain into power, turned longing into lullabies. And then finally, after years of trying, of pleading, of praying, a heartbeat. Ren Charles was born in January 2001. He wasn't just a baby. He was a miracle. The culmination of every needle, every whispered prayer at dawn, every silent night spent wondering if her body had failed her. She held him like the world had disappeared. But fate wasn't finished testing her. In 2009, as whispers of a comeback album echoed through the industry, Celine suffered a miscarriage. No statement, no announcement, just private, quiet devastation, and still, she tried again. At age 42, when most women consider motherhood behind them, she braved another round of IVF. And in 2010, twins were born: Nelson and Eddie. Two more miracles, but even joy came with scars. Her body was tired, her spirit frayed. The same voice that once shook arenas now sang only in dim nurseries to an audience of 3 small boys, none of whom knew how hard their mother had fought to bring them here. Then, in 2016, everything shattered again. Ren, the father of her children, the love of her life, was gone. And overnight, Celine became not just a mother, but a widow, a protector, a lighthouse guiding 3 little ships through a storm no child should have to see. The woman who once filled stadiums now sang lullabies in silence. No applause, no spotlight, only blankets, nightlights, and the weight of being everything for everyone. And she never let them see her break. Because for Céline Dion, motherhood wasn't a title. It was a mission. It was a war she fought with every cell of her body, every breath of her voice, every note of her soul. And when she looks into the eyes of Ren, Charles, Nelson, and Eddie, she doesn't just see sons. She sees survival. She sees every shot, every loss, every night she sang to an empty womb. She sees why she never gave up. And in the hush between her softest lyrics, if the world listens close enough, they'll hear it too. Not just the voice of a diva, but of a mother who bled through silence to build the family she now holds like something sacred. For decades, her voice felt éternel, unshakable, limitless, divine. It bent time. It broke language. It healed. But then, something began to change. At first, it was subtle. A breath that came too late. A phrase that didn't land quite right. An ache in the ribs after a show she used to breeze through. She thought it was fatigue, stress, age. But deep down, a quiet fear was forming. And that fear was right. What started as stiffness became pain. Then spasms. Then full-body lockdowns that left her gasping, unable to move, to sing, to speak. Her body, once trained to move with melody, was turning against her. Muscles locked like iron. Jaws clenched involuntarily. Limbs trembling with every breath she tried to steal. To outsiders, she smiled. On stage, she dazzled. But backstage, she collapsed. In secret, she began taking doses of Valium dangerously high, just to function. Not to calm anxiety, but to sit, to eat, to survive. I could have died, she would later confess. Not in drama, but in quiet disbelief. Because for someone whose entire life had been voice, breath, and movement, to lose those things wasn't just illness. It was erasure. Then in December 2022, the truth was finally revealed. Stiff person syndrome, a rare, degenerative neurological disorder that locks the body in place, turning muscle into steel, turning freedom into memory. Suddenly, the woman who once floated across stages in gowns of gold couldn't stand without assistance. In her documentary I Am, Céline Dion, the world saw what she had hidden for years. Not a diva in decline, but a warrior in collapse. In one haunting scene, she lies on a therapy table, face contorted, hands clenched, body writhing. Her therapist whispers, "Squeeze if it hurts." She squeezes, again and again, until even the room seems to ache for her. There's no orchestra there, no audience, just a woman fighting for control of her own limbs. She tries to sing and says almost to herself, "If it cracks, but if it works, it'll be the happiest day of my life." Because for Céline Dion, this isn't just a diagnosis. It's a death of identity, the slow crumbling of the very thing that made her who she is. But even now, when her body betrays her, her spirit does not. She returns to the studio, not to record, but to remember. She hums, she whispers, she breathes. Because even if the voice cracks, the soul still sings. Her journey now is not about charts, not about comeback tours. It's about reclaiming fragments of control, of dignity, of the self she's been forced to let go of piece by piece. And in that fragile, defiant hum, she is louder than ever. Because Céline Dion may no longer stand on stage, but she is still standing. And that after everything is the greatest performance of her life. The curtains closed, the stages emptied, the applause faded into memory. But Céline Dion didn't vanish. She retreated with purpose. Once, her world was measured in tour dates, backstage passes, costume changes, and arena schedules. Now, it's measured in minutes of movement, therapy sessions, and whispers of breath between spasms. Her $4.5 million estate in Nevada, once filled with rehearsals, stylists, and songwriters, is now quiet, but not hollow. It's filled with something deeper, healing, reflection, a slower kind of strength. The woman who used to shake stadiums now rises carefully, step by fragile step. Her mornings begin not with vocal warm-ups, but with carefully calibrated physical therapy designed to teach her body how to move again, how to hold itself without turning to stone. Her meals are anti-inflammatory, her exercises slow, her rest sacred. There are no sound checks, only silences she's learning to live with. She no longer performs for millions, but every time she lifts her hand without pain, it is a standing ovation. Every deep breath without spasms is a triumph more meaningful than any Grammy. And yet music has never left her. Her home studio still exists. She visits it not to record albums, but to remember who she is. She hums lullabies to her sons in the quiet of morning. She rehearses breathwork with vocal coaches, not for the world, but for herself. Because to Celine, singing was never a performance. It was prayer. And prayer doesn't need an audience. Behind the scarves and sunglasses, paparazzi capture as she's helped into a vehicle. There is no shame. There is only grit. The world sees a thinner figure, a slower walk, but her fire, unchanged. She's no longer chasing stadiums. She's chasing presence. Her sons Ren, Charles, now a young artist carving his own voice, and twins Nelson and Eddie, growing quietly away from the spotlight, remain her greatest focus. She is still their compass, still their anchor, still their mother. She supervises their schooling, their emotional growth, their exposure to art, not from the perspective of fame, but from the depths of a woman who has earned every second of motherhood. And while the headlines talk about cancelled tours and health battles, what they don't see is the quiet transformation of a legend who has nothing left to prove, but everything left to protect. Céline Dion's voice may no longer echo in coliseums, but it lives in a softer symphony now, in bedtime songs, in private humming, in the strength it takes to simply keep going. She has traded fireworks for stillness, but in that stillness, she is no less extraordinary. Because the stage she stands on now isn't made of wood, it's made of will. And she performs every single day, not for applause, but for life. There comes a moment in every artist's life when their voice is no longer just theirs. It belongs to everyone. For Céline Dion, that moment came long ago, but its echo is eternal. Her voice has cradled weddings, funerals, hospital beds, long drives home, and quiet cries in the dark. It has lived inside people not as sound, but as solace. Not just as performance, but as prayer. My Heart Will Go On is not just a song. It's a collective exhale of grief and memory. Because You Loved Me is not just a ballad. It's the soundtrack to 1,000 love stories, spoken and unspoken. Even now, when her voice no longer climbs stadium rafters, it lives elsewhere. In hearts, in headphones, in the whispered lyrics of strangers who never met her, but feel like they know her better than family. That's the thing about legacy. It doesn't fade when the spotlight dims. It grows louder in silence. Her music has outlived charts and trends. In a world obsessed with reinvention, Celine remained true to her sound, to her soul, to us. And while some artists chase virality, Celine built something deeper, a permanent residence inside memory. Her voice became the hymn of a generation. It comforted cancer patients, whispered strength to grieving mothers, and held the hands of people who thought they were alone until her voice reminded them they weren't. And she gave it all without scandal, without ego, without forgetting the drawer she once slept in. Her charity work, quiet, tireless, under the radar, spoke even louder. She championed cystic fibrosis research in memory of her niece Karine. She visited children's hospitals not for photo ops, but because she remembered what it was like to ache and be unseen. Celine didn't just give us songs. She gave us herself. She sang through exhaustion, through grief, through motherhood, through illness. Every note was earned. Not Guillaume, and that's what makes her story holy. She didn't rise because of branding. She rose because the world needed her to. Even now, with a body that resists and a voice that falters, her presence lingers. Not as sound, but as meaning. In a noisy world, she taught us the beauty of stillness. In a fast world, she gave us something eternal. And long after she sung her last public note, long after the charts stopped counting, we'll still hear her. In the first dance of a new couple, in the trembling lip of a mourner, in the breath of someone choosing to keep going, simply because her voice once walked them through the fire. Celine Dion's story was never just about music. It was about resilience. The stages, the awards, the sold-out tours, they were chapters. But the story was written in what happened when the lights went off, in the silence between notes, in the breath before the next verse, in the moments when no one was watching and she chose to sing anyway. She didn't need to be the loudest. She needed to be true. When her husband died, she stood. When her brother died, she carried on. When her body failed her, she bent but did not break. While the world measured success in platinum albums, she measured it in persistence. In walking through grief with grace, in mothering when her heart was shattered, in holding on to her purpose when even her voice slipped from her grasp. There are many great singers, but few witnesses to what it means to be human like Celine. She didn't chase trends. She didn't reinvent herself for headlines. She remained soft, steady, sincere, and now, even as her voice quiets, her story roars louder than ever. It tells us, you don't need to be unbreakable. You just need to keep choosing to rise. You don't need perfect health or a perfect past or the world's approval. You just need one reason to keep going. One note, one breath, one child's hand in yours. Because in the end, Céline Dion didn't just carry melodies. She carried millions of us through our darkest hours. So now we ask you, what song carried you? What lyric of hers pulled you from the edge, made you feel seen, reminded you that you still had something worth fighting for? Tell us. Leave your voice in the chorus she built, so even when she can no longer sing, she'll hear us singing back. Because some voices never leave us. They just live quietly inside the parts of us they once healed.